You know this voice. Even if you think you don't, your subconscious does. It is the texture of 1993. It is the sound echoing in the back seat of a Jeep cruising through Harlem at 2 a.m. It is the vibration of the Quiet Storm radio format that lulled millions of Americans to sleep for a decade. You have likely fallen in love to his melodies. You have definitely cried to his lyrics. If you are a fan of Mary J. Blige, the queen of hip-hop soul, he is the invisible force that taught her how to transmute her pain into gold on her debut album. But here is the brutal, uncomfortable truth. You probably don't know that he is dead. His name was Kenny Green, and his story is one of the most tragic disappearing acts in modern music history. In the pantheon of the 90s, we worship the loud legends. We know Tupac Shakur. We know the notorious Blige. We know Aaliyah. We mourn them publicly. We wear their faces on vintage t-shirts sold in malls across America. Their deaths were cultural earthquakes that stopped the world. But Kenny Green exists in a different category. He is a ghost. He is a man who built the very foundation of modern R&B, handed the keys to the superstars, and then quietly dissolved into the shadows, erased by a stigma that the world was too cowardly to discuss. Kenny was the lead singer of the group Intro, but calling him a singer is like calling Michael Jordan a basketball player. It's a factual statement, but it misses the entire point of his existence. Kenny was an architect. When the 90s arrived, black music was going through a violent identity crisis. The glitter and neon of the 80s were dead. The streets were cracking under the weight of the drug epidemic. The youth didn't want polished pop stars anymore. They wanted reality. They wanted Timberland boots, oversized hoodies, and raw, unfiltered emotion. Kenny Green was the secret weapon who figured out how to make that pain sound beautiful. He bridged the gap between the holy church pew and the gritty street corner. He was the pen behind the queen. He was the baritone that anchored the New Jack Swing era. He was a genius. And yet, when he died on October 1st, 2001, barely 3 weeks after the World Trade Center fell, his passing was met with a deafening silence. There were no televised tributes, no Lifetime Achievement Awards. At his funeral, the pews were not overflowing with the celebrities he had helped create. He was buried in a military cemetery, not as a music icon, but as a former soldier. Just a name on a white stone in a vast sea of grass. Why does a man with a voice described as once in a generation vanish so completely? The answer is not just about bad luck. It is about a secret he carried. It is about the brutal price of masculinity in the 90s. It is about a disease that people whispered about in barbershops, but refused to understand. This video is not just a biography. It is an excavation. We are going to dig up the floorboards of 90s R&B to find the man buried underneath. We are going to trace the line from the gospel choirs of Detroit to the VIP sections of New York, and finally to that lonely hospital bed where the music stopped. This is the story of the man who saved R&B, but could not save himself. To understand the ghost, you must first understand the machine. And the machine that built Kenny Green was Detroit, Michigan. In the late 70s and early 80s, Detroit was not just a city. It was a frequency. It was a place forged in fire and steel, humming with the rhythmic clanking of automobile factories and the lingering ghostly legacy of Motown records. But Detroit is also a city of dichotomies. It is where incredible beauty meets crushing industrial decay. It is a place where hope and hardship live on the same block. For the Green family, music wasn't a hobby. It was a language. It lived in the peeling paint of the walls, carried through open windows on humid summer nights, and spilled out of church doors on Sunday mornings. Kenny was born into this rhythm. Witnesses from his childhood recall a boy who was quiet, almost shy, and introvert in a loud city. He wasn't the kid at the center of the playground fights. He was the observer. But that demeanor evaporated the moment he stepped into the sanctuary. The church was his first stage, and the choir was his first family. He spent hours in those wooden pews, absorbing the visceral sound of the gospel. It was here that Kenny learned the most important lesson of his life, a lesson that would later define the intro sound. He learned that a voice is not just about hitting the high notes, it is about the anointing. For those unfamiliar with the Black church tradition, the anointing is the ability to make a listener feel the presence of something greater than themselves. It's not technique, it's transmission. When young Kenny opened his mouth, he didn't sound like a child. He sounded like an old soul carrying a heavy burden. He sang with a texture that suggested he had already lived 1,000 lifetimes of heartbreak. But Detroit could be a hard teacher. By the time Kenny reached 18, the city was struggling. The economy was cracking under the weight of globalization. The streets were becoming unforgiving, offering only two clear paths for young Black men with limited resources: the hustle of the corner or the escape of a ticket out. Kenny chose the ticket. But surprisingly, he didn't run to Hollywood. He didn't run to a record label. He ran to the recruiters. He enlisted in the United States Army. On paper, it seems like a complete paradox. Why would a creative soul bursting with melody and sensitivity submit himself to the rigid, colorless, hyper-masculine world of the military? He did not go there seeking fame. He went there to survive. He went to find discipline. In the context of working-class Black America in the 80s, the Army was often the only viable way to keep your head above water to get 3 meals a day and a sense of direction. Yet you cannot kill a gift like his. Even in uniform, surrounded by rifles, drill sergeants, and the monotony of base life, his voice found a way out. On military bases where days were grueling and nights were incredibly lonely, Kenny became a legend in the barracks. He sang in the showers, utilizing the tile acoustics to amplify his rich tone. He sang in the recreation halls. He sang to keep his spirit alive in a place designed to break the individual down into a unit. And it was there, in this unlikely crucible of discipline and camouflage, that he met a man who would change his life forever. Clinton Buddy White. Buddy was another soldier with music stitched into his bones. They were two Black men far from home, brothers in arms and brothers in song. They sat on their bunks, harmonizing over the sound of rain hitting the tin roofs, dreaming of a world far away from orders and salutes. They made a pact: when the uniforms came off, the music would take over. They didn't want to be soldiers forever. They wanted to be stars. When their service ended, they didn't go back to the safety of home. They followed the magnetic pull of the culture. They went to the center of the universe. They packed their bags and headed for New York City. They linked up with a dancer and singer from Brooklyn named Jeff Sanders. The trio was now complete. They moved into cramped apartments, sleeping on floors, sharing cheap meals from corner bodegas, and rehearsing until their throats were raw. They named themselves Intro, Innovative, New, Talent, Reaching, Out. It was a name full of earnest hope. But hope doesn't pay the rent in New York City. They needed a break. And in the early 90s, the music industry wasn't something you emailed or tweeted at. It was a fortress you had to physically break into. One night in a crowded, smoke-filled club, they saw their target. Heavy D. The self-proclaimed overweight lover was rap royalty. He was a tastemaker for Uptown Records, the label run by Andre Harrell and a young Sean Puffy Combs. Uptown was defining the sound of the era, a mix of high-fashion swagger and street-corner reality. Most people would have been too scared to approach Heavy D. He traveled with an entourage. He was surrounded by the deafening noise of celebrity. Most aspiring singers would have tried to hand him a demo tape, a piece of plastic that would inevitably end up in a trash can before the night was over. Intro didn't have a tape. They had their guts. And they had Kenny. They cornered him. Right there, in the middle of the noise and the chaos, they didn't ask for permission. They didn't ask for a meeting. They simply snapped their fingers to set the tempo. And then, they sang. No music. No microphones. No auto-tune. Just three voices blending into a harmony so tight, so technically perfect, that it cut through the noise of the club like a laser beam. Heavy D stopped moving. He looked at these three young men fresh out of the army, hungry, desperate, and talented, beyond measure, and he heard something money couldn't buy. He heard the future. He didn't just say, "Good job." He opened the door. And just like that, the soldier from Detroit stepped out of the barracks and into the boardroom of R&B. But when Intro stepped into the studio with Uptown Records' Kenny Green, was not content to simply stand behind a microphone and sing what he was told. He looked around at the mixing boards, the producers, the chaotic machinery of making hits, and he realized something crucial. In this industry, the voice gets you in the door, but the pen keeps you in the room. Kenny wasn't just a singer, he was a writer. And he arrived at the perfect moment. The early 90s were witnessing a violent shift in sonic tectonic plates. The polished, glossy synthesizer-heavy soul music of the 80s was dying. The streets of New York didn't want glitter anymore. They wanted grit. They wanted beats that knocked like hip-hop heavy with samples and breakbeats, but they still craved vocals that soared like gospel. This was the birth of hip-hop soul, and Kenny Green became its silent architect. He began working closely with Dave "Jam" Hall, a producer who was looking for a new sound. Together, they found the perfect vessel for their work, a young guarded woman from the Schlobohm housing projects of Yonkers named Mary J. Blige. At that time, Mary was unlike anyone the world had seen. She didn't wear evening gowns. She wore combat boots and backward baseball caps. She didn't carry herself like a diva. She carried herself like a rapper. She was raw. She was unpolished. She was real. The label wanted to make her a star, but they had a problem. They needed songs that could translate her hardness into heartbreak. They needed lyrics that felt tough enough for the streets, but vulnerable enough for the bedroom. Kenny Green was the translator. He sat down and wrote, "Reminisce." If you listen to that song today, really pay attention to the arrangement. It isn't complicated. But the genius is in the space Kenny left behind. He understood that for Mary's voice to shine, the song had to breathe. He wrote pockets of silence into the melody, allowing her to moan to ad-lib, to let her natural pain seep into the track. He didn't try to clean her up. He framed her roughness like a diamond. Then he wrote, "Love No Limit." This was a jazz fusion masterpiece. It was sophisticated. It proved that the girl from the projects could be smooth. Kenny's background vocals on that track are like a warm blanket wrapped around Mary's lead. He wasn't just backing her up, he was holding her up. Most young artists in Kenny's position would have been terrified. They would have hoarded these songs. They would have thought, if I give this hit to her, what will be left for me? But Kenny possessed the generosity of a true master. He understood that a song has a destiny. It must find the voice it belongs to. He gave Mary the foundation of her career. He built the throne for the queen of hip-hop soul. When Mary's debut album, What's the 411, dropped in 1992, it changed the course of music history. It bridged the gap between the b-boys and the church girls. And while Mary stood in the spotlight, accepting the roses and the accolades, Kenny Green stood quietly in the liner notes, smiling. His work on that album earned him the ASCAP Songwriter of the Year award. He stood on the podium alongside legends like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. He was in his early 20s, and he was already shaping the sound of America. But Kenny was not destined to stay in the background forever. The songs he wrote for others were just the warm-up. He had saved something for himself. He had saved the harmony. It was time for Intro to step out of the shadows. In 1993, the world finally met Intro. Their debut album was not just a collection of songs. It was a declaration of intent. In an era where boy bands like Boyz II Men or Shay were dominating the charts, and where labels were beginning to focus heavily on synchronized dancing, matching outfits, and image, Intro focused on one thing above all else: the sound. They released Come Inside. It was a track that captured the sweat and the intimacy of a humid New York summer night. It was seductive, it was smooth, and it was undeniably grown. It wasn't bubblegum pop designed for teenagers. It was music for people who had lived a little. It was music for the bedroom, not just the dance floor. But the moment that truly defined Kenny Green and defined the legacy of the group was a decision that many people in the industry called suicide. They decided to cover Stevie Wonder. In the world of R&B, Stevie Wonder is sacred ground. You do not touch a song like Ribbon in the Sky unless you are prepared to be destroyed by the comparison. It is considered a perfect composition. To cover it is usually an act of arrogance, but for Kenny, it was an act of homage. When Intro released their version of Ribbon in the Sky, they didn't try to outsing Stevie. They didn't try to make it pop or add a hip-hop beat to modernize it cheaply. They slowed it down. They stripped it back, and Kenny Green stepped to the front. This is where we must talk about his voice. At that time, R&B was dominated by the high-floating tenor. Think of the soaring notes of Tevin Campbell, the falsetto of El DeBarge, or the legacy of Michael Jackson. High notes were equated with passion. Kenny was different. He was a baritone. His voice was deep, thick, and textured like molasses. It sat in the lower register, rumbling in your chest rather than piercing your ears. It was a man's voice, grounded, secure, and incredibly vulnerable. It had a gravelly quality to it, a roughness that suggested he had smoke and whiskey in his throat, even though he was a disciplined singer. When he sang the opening notes of that cover, he brought a new weight to the lyrics. He sounded like a man who had actually lived through the storm and was finally seeing the rainbow. He didn't sound like he was performing. He sounded like he was testifying. The cover was a smash hit. It proved that Intro wasn't just a trend. They were musicians. The album went gold. The tours followed. For 2 years, Kenny Green lived the life that every kid in Detroit dreams of. Non-stop travel, crowded clubs from London to Tokyo, sleepless nights in hotel rooms filled with women who knew every note before the group even opened their mouths. He was the center of the harmony, the anchor that held it all together. On stage, Kenny was a quiet force. He didn't need pyrotechnics. He didn't need backflips. He would simply stand there, close his eyes, grip the microphone stand, and let that rich, dark voice fill the arena. You could see the audience physically react to him, heads tilting back, eyes closing, bodies swaying as if caught in a trance. He had the rare ability to make a room full of 2,000 strangers feel like they were the only two people in the world. For a moment, everything they had worked for in those cramped apartments was real. The money was flowing. The acclaim was universal. Kenny Green had proven that a church boy from Detroit could conquer the world without losing his soul. But success in the music industry is a fragile thing. It is built on sand. And just as the sun was shining brightest on Kenny Green, the clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. The golden era was about to end, and a new, harder, flashier sound was coming to wash everything away. By 1995, the landscape was shifting again. If the early 90s were about grit and Timberland boots, the mid-90s were becoming about gloss. The bad boy era had arrived. Puff Daddy was introducing a sound that was sample-heavy radio-friendly and focused on a lifestyle of extreme excess. The music videos weren't about singing in the rain anymore. They were about yachts, expensive cars, and Hype Williams's fisheye lenses. Intro released a second album, New Life. Musically, it was excellent. It showed growth, but the machinery of the industry had moved on. The audience's attention span was shortening. The sales didn't match the debut. The phone calls from executives started to slow down. The group, feeling the pressure of a changing market and internal creative differences, eventually disbanded. For most artists of Kenny's caliber, this is the moment of the pivot. This is where they reinvent themselves. With his songwriting resume, Kenny could have easily become a super producer. He could have been the next Babyface. He could have stayed behind the boards churning out hits for the next generation of stars, like Usher or Brandy. He certainly had the talent to do it. But Kenny Green was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with record sales or Billboard charts. While the world was distracted by the East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop wars, Kenny was quietly fighting a war against his own body. Rumors began to circulate in the industry, whispers in the back of recording studios, glances exchanged in VIP sections. We have to contextualize this. In the mid to late 90s, the Black community and the world at large was in the grip of the AIDS epidemic. But unlike today, where medical advancements have made it a manageable condition back then, it was often a death sentence, wrapped in shame. It was a subject shrouded in fear and religious stigma. It was the thing you didn't talk about, especially not if you were a male R&B sex symbol. Kenny, the man who had sung about love, intimacy, and vulnerability, so openly found himself forced into isolation. Friends and associates noticed the change. The vibrant, muscular soldier who had once charmed Heavy D began to fade. The weight fell off his frame. The energy that once commanded arenas began to dim. His skin, once glowing under stage lights, looked tired. He continued to write. He continued to create, because music was the only thing that made sense to him. But the physical toll was undeniable. This is the part of the story that hurts the most, because it highlights the abandonment. The music industry is notoriously transactional. It loves you when you are hot. It invites you to the parties, sends you the gift baskets, and calls you family. But the moment the hits stop, or the moment you become complicated, the machinery ejects you. As Kenny got sicker, the circle around him tightened. The entourage disappeared. The executives who had profited millions from his pen were suddenly too busy. The stigma of his illness, coupled with the brutal, "what have you done for me lately" culture of the business, pushed him further into seclusion. He wasn't just fighting a virus, he was fighting the silence. He spent his final years not in the spotlight, but in the shadows of the city he had helped conquer. He watched as the genre he helped build, hip-hop soul, exploded globally. He watched Mary J. Blige become a global icon, singing the style he helped craft. He watched the world move on while he remained stuck in a private battle for survival. It was a slow, quiet tragedy. There were no cameras documenting this struggle. There were no reality TV shows. Just a man, his fading health, and the memories of a time when the world listened to his every word. The soldier was alone on the battlefield. Then came September 11th, 2001. The world stopped spinning. New York City. The concrete playground where intro had become kings was suddenly covered in ash and debris. The skyline was broken. The national consciousness was entirely consumed by terrorism war grief and the desperate search for survivors in the rubble. The airwaves were no longer playing R&B. They were filled with 24-hour news cycles, presidential addresses, and images of a nation on its knees. Music felt trivial. Celebrity felt irrelevant. 3 weeks later, October 1st, 2001. While the smoke was still physically rising from ground zero, while the country was still holding its breath, Kenny Green took his last one. He was only 32 years old. The timing was tragically, brutally poetic. The world was so consumed by a massive global tragedy that it completely missed the personal tragedy of losing a musical genius. There was no space in the news cycle for Kenny Green. There was no crawl on the bottom of the CNN screen. Even MTV and BET were focused on the national recovery. Kenny's death didn't just happen. It evaporated. There was no grand funeral procession through the streets of Harlem. There were no weeping fans lining the blocks. There was no star-studded tribute concert at Madison Square Garden. His brother, in a rare and heartbreaking interview years later, revealed the cold reality of that day. He said that at the funeral, he looked around the pews. He was expecting to see the faces of the superstars Kenny had written for. He expected to see the executives who had built their mansions on the foundation of Kenny's publishing royalties. He expected to see the family of the music industry. They weren't there. The church was mostly filled with family old friends from the neighborhood and the people who knew Kenny before he was Kenny from Intro. The industry that had squeezed every drop of talent out of him had moved on before his body was even in the ground. Kenny was buried in Calverton National Cemetery on Long Island. Because he had served in the Army, he was entitled to a military burial. And that is what he got. A folded flag, a gun salute, a standard-issue white stone marker in a field of identical white stone markers. If you walk past his grave today, you won't see musical notes carved into the stone. You won't see Songwriter of the Year. You won't see Legend. You will simply see his name, his rank, and the dates. To the passerby, this grave belongs to a soldier who served his country. And that is true. Kenny was a soldier. But buried beneath that soil is also a voice that defined a generation. Buried there is the melody of Love No Limit. Buried there is the soul of Intro. He lived as an architect of sound, but he died as just another number. The silence that surrounded his death was louder than any ovation he ever received. It seemed for a moment that the erasure was complete. The ghost had finally vanished. But true art is stubborn. It refuses to stay buried. It has been over 2 decades since Kenny left us. And slowly, very slowly, the fog is lifting. Thanks to the internet, a new generation is discovering Intro. They are stumbling upon Ribbon in the Sky on TikTok or YouTube algorithms and stopping dead in their tracks. They are asking, who is this guy? Why does his voice hurt so good? They are digging into the crates. They are reading the credits on Mary J. Blige's classic albums and seeing the name K. Green stamped there like a seal of quality. We tell this story today not just to mourn him, but to restore him. Kenny Green's life teaches us a brutal lesson about the fleeting nature of fame, but more importantly, it teaches us about the enduring power of true talent. Trends change. The shiny suits of the late 90s look ridiculous now. The overproduced beats of that era have aged poorly. But Kenny's voice, it is timeless. It sounds as fresh, as urgent, and as necessary today as it did in the back of that Jeep in 1993. He was the soldier who found his weapon in a melody. He was the architect who built a castle for others, for Mary, for Uptown Records, for R&B itself, and then quietly walked away before anyone could say thank you. So the next time you hear a 90s R&B classic, listen closely to the background vocals. Listen to the texture of the harmony. You might just hear him, the ghost in the machine, still singing, still reaching out. Kenny Green? Remember the name. If you didn't know Kenny's story before today, or if you remember playing that intro tape until it popped, let me know in the comments below. Which intro song is your favorite? And if you want us to dig up more stories of the forgotten legends of music history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are just getting started. Thanks for watching.